Now, I know you'll have lots of responses to Kunal and Dirk, but I'm going to, I'm afraid, get you just to sort of sit on them a little bit, because I do want to give people in the room a chance to raise some reflections and questions too, and then get you to maybe run through a series of sort of pithy, short responses. Okay, let's start at this end of the room, and could you identify yourself and also just really keep your intervention reasonably short, because we do have a lot of people who want to engage.
Yes, Matthew Cadbury, UN Women. It seems to me from what you're saying, you're not suggesting a kind of averaging of the two previous approaches, rather that you've got to overlay one on the other. So you must do all of the Washington consensus and have an activist government. And my particular area of interest is trade policy. So I ask, are you therefore suggesting developing countries should remove their tariff barriers to get free trade, to get an accurate assessment of comparative advantage?
Okay, fine. Go behind you to Hugh.
I'm Hugh Emmons-Smith. I'm an independent researcher. I'm sure you're pushing on an open door in calling for a new approach to development economics, as Harjun perhaps got there first.
Speak up a bit, Hugh. Yeah.
Harjun perhaps got there first. But I had difficulty identifying the emphasis on pragmatism in policy is wonderful. The emphasis on looking at what have we seen in the world is also good. But underlying that, what is the economic theory, I found myself asking. And my question really flows from a bit of another strand in economics which has emerged recently, the new economic geography. And if you take that as your theoretical foundation, it might point to cumulative advantage as a source of growth. And for example, if you're a person in a disadvantaged country, you might be more inclined to move to one of the countries that got a better start, rather than try and effect the structural transformation you're talking about in your own country. And of course, this is not a policy that's widely welcomed in the world, but I do wonder how you view the input of new economic geography, which suggests to me that not all the things you recommend would work very well in some cases.
Okay, thank you. To the back here, to this gentleman here, and then I'll come down the front. And then, don't worry, I've seen you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Peter Hinton, Summit Development Group. We invest in banks in Africa to focus on SMEs. And ironically, we're a Botswana-based company, so we can relate to what you were saying about Botswana. My question is it the role of government in terms of encouraging SME development and creating facilitating environments, or does that come from somewhere else? And how important is that SME development in terms of what you're proposing?
Okay, thank you very much. We'll bring the mic down the front here, please, to Duncan and then Sheila. I'll come back and then... Sorry, Malcolm's on his own today. He's got... Duncan first.
Okay, Duncan Green from Oxfam. Thanks, Justin. When you were speaking, I was just thinking Korean iron and steel. Would you have said that sitting in Korea in the 1950s, that iron and steel was an obvious example of latent comparative advantage for Korea? If so, you'd be a very visionary person. But the other, and how does this all link with finance? So to what extent does the globalization of finance, does the power of financial markets actually act as a massive constraint to anyone doing what you just suggested?
Okay, Sheila.
Sheila Page, ODI. I'd like to comment on the imitation element of all of this, because it strikes me that the examples you gave of success weren't imitation. They were learning, but not imitation. And you cannot really, particularly in now, develop on the basis of what was successful in the last 20 years in any other country, because those industries will not exist in the next 20 years. It's not what other countries did. And going back to Dirk's recipes and so on, it isn't, you're actually, one way to cook is to memorize every conceivable recipe and apply it. But another, and this is rather more successful and certainly more sustainable, is to learn some principles and try to apply those and to adapt the recipes that are there. And I'm really reminded very much, particularly coming from someone who's been at the World Bank, of the problem I identified in about almost 20 years ago of pineapple and prawns. At the time, the World Bank was going around to all developing countries saying you really must diversify your economies, and two very good areas are pineapple and prawns, with the excellent advantage that now pineapple and prawns are among the cheapest commodities you can get. The recipe should have been find something someone else hasn't thought of and diversify into it. So I really would question this imitation.
Okay, I'm going to take a pause there and give Justin a chance. Now, obviously there's a lot, so don't feel you have to answer everyone, but just maybe start with some general comments and I'll come back.
Well, I think that first I appreciate very much your participation and also raise very critical questions. And I'll start with this, audience. Regarding my approach, certainly it's not a simple combination of two old approaches. I think it's a new approach. In a sense, I approach the issue in a very dialectic approach. In the past, you emphasize too much on market values, and then you look into too much on the government values. And my approach is not to say market value or to government value. I approach is that, well, areas you have market values, then you need to have a government intervention. But if area which market can perform well, then you should allow the market to perform. And so it's not just simple, a mix of market or government. It depends on the nature of the production activities, the nature of economic activities. And that's my response to the first question. The second one about the economic geography. Well, I think that, if you want to be competitive in the world, there's two principles. One is your factor endowments. The other one is specialization. And so I look more on the factor endowments because I want to, talk about the economic development. Economic development always means you move from low skill, less capital intensive, to more, skill intensive, capital intensive. And that is development in the natures, okay. But if you want to compete with countries which are on the same level of development, with similar endowment structure, then you need to rely on specialization. And in my work so far, I did not discuss as much as I should. And if I want to discuss how to compete with countries which are on the same level of development, then economic geography will become more important because then it will help you to identify areas which you can specialize. So that's my response to the second question. Then the third one about the SMEs. I think it's very important for the developing countries because, most developing countries, they have competitive advantages in inexpensive labor cost. And in the labor-intensive sectors, in general, the firm, their size are small in terms of the capital requirement and in terms of, the physical side of the companies. And so SMEs will be a very important, vehicles for the country to go into the sectors which they have competitive advantages. And the government certainly should create the enabling environment for the SMEs to acquire new technologies, to get access to capitals, and also to foreign exchanges so they can import necessary equipment or raw materials and turn their labor force into competitiveness of the nation. So I think that's very important. And then about the steel industry in Korea in 1970s, not 1950s, 1970s. And I would say it's exactly the example that consistent with my framework. Because by the time of 1960s, 70, Korean developed very labor-intensive type of activities like garment, like plywood, like wig in the 1960s. Very competitive and accumulated capitals. So by the time of 1970s, they should upgrade their industries. Okay. And what should be the target for their upgrade industry? I think steel industry is a very good example because steel industries was a mature industry in Japan. And it has developed in Japan for centuries. So by the time of the 1970s, it's a mature industries. And the limitation is that for the steel industry, it requires large capital the large capital investment for it's a lumpy investment. And in the 1970s, the Korean financial sectors, in the market, they did not have the ability to mobilize large capital investment. So with the government's support to entering into a sector which is mature and which has been in Japan, for centuries, and it's a sunset industry in Japan. And so for them to go into that kind of sunset industry in Japan, and their per capita income was about 30% of Japanese per capita income in the 1970s. Exactly an example confirming my growth identification and facilitation. Okay. Then I come into the, learning. Imitation certainly, has some component of learning. And imitation also requires some kind of process innovation. So it's not just copying. Actually, it certainly is innovation in a sense. Especially, you need to combine imitation with process innovation to make you competitive.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to this side of the room now. Welcome, wherever you are. Come over this side. The gentleman in the blue shirt at the end. Right at the end. There, that's it.
Hi, Justin. My name is Mark Boland. I work for IHS Global Insight covering sub-Saharan African economies, and I've got two questions. The first one is, to what extent does the shift directly from an agricultural-based economy to a service sector-based economy we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa, to what extent does that reflect existing comparative advantages, and is it sustainable, or will it lead to a growth spurt followed by ensuing stagnation, as Mr. Sen was discussing? And to the second question relates to how would you compare the position of the East Asian tigers now versus the incumbent, whether it's US or Germany or Japan, and to China now, considering the size of the Chinese workforce, the high class of the infrastructure, and the general reduction in trade barriers. And we've at least seen some anecdotal evidence that higher wage costs in China is leading to increased automation in production rather than moving to low-wage countries.
Okay, thank you. Over here, sorry, where these people, Stephanie, and then straight behind Stephanie, please.
Thank you for the excellent presentation, Justin. Two questions, if I may. The first one, you didn't talk so much about instruments, and I was wondering what your view is. For example, just take one thing, development banks or public sector banks, which can help implement these kind of policies. My second point is a bit of a disagreement, at the risk of being old-fashioned. I don't agree so much that, at least in Latin America, the import substitution structure had disappointing results. Because if you look actually at the data, in terms of growth, in terms of employment generation, they were very, very good. I think also in India. They're very good empirical analysis of that. I think what happened was that it was a little bit caricature by the neoclassical economics, and then it was attacked. What was attacked was a caricature, sort of a strategy that Hegel always used to criticize. But I think why it's important that, not just a sort of historical discussion, but also because if we have a continuation of much lower growth of trade, we don't know if it's a cyclical thing, but trade is not growing at all this year. But if trade slows down and if the growth in developed countries continues to be so slow, there may be some need for rethinking. And if China turns more inwards, there may need to be some more rethinking of to what extent to rely so much on dynamic external markets, like the East Asian economies and China in particular recently has done, or to also rely on domestic and regional markets.
Thanks, Stephanie. Behind you, gentleman there.
Thank you, Dr. Lin. I'm just wondering, after the Washington consensus, do you have any idea or the envision that what is the future world political economy system gonna look like? Yeah.
Wow. Maybe for another day. Over on the corner there. Bill Martin. I'll take one more.
Justin, could we have a little case study, your application, what China should do now?
And then to the gentleman in the second row there, and then I'm going to close it and allow Justin to wrap up as much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Okay, coming from a country like Angola, I'd like to know
Angola.
I'd like to know what sort of political arrangement would be compatible to the new structural economics. Thank you.
How do you get the right cooks? I think is what
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think that I appreciate very much. The first one regarding the instrument, I think it can either be development agency or it can be development bank. Because I mentioned, you need to improve infrastructure. And a hard infrastructure development bank will be a very good, vehicles. But if you want to give some kind of tax incentive, then you need to have a government involvement. And development agency can do that, right? So I implicitly discussed that, but certainly I did not make that a big chapter. Second one, the import substitution. If you look into the period import substitution, just like people argue that their performance in the 1960s and the 70s was even better than the 1980s and 1990s in terms of growth, in terms of job creation, in terms of stability. But the issue with the import substitution that in general, they would have a period of investment that grows. Then they started to stagnate. And then they encounter all kind of crises. And also in that period of time, in general, the government also used all kind of instruments to protect certain kind of employment. So they are going to have some kind of increase in employment. But the issue is that stagnation, then employment creation become of trouble for the young people and so on. And if you look into a successful country, the East Asian, they always are very dynamic. And that kind of dynamism creates more resources for further investment and in a sustainable way. And as a result, they create a huge number of jobs. And they turn a labor-abundant country to labor-scarce country. Like in East Asian countries, economies, in general population density is the highest in the world, right? But now they're importing labor force from other countries because their dynamism created many jobs. And the import substitution strategy, especially in the older import substitution strategies, they cannot do that. It's because of their investment is not sustainable in a sense. They're going to sectors which rely on protection instead of, with the ability to generate more residuals, more resources for further investment. Then coming to, whether that we have, the global economy is slowing down because of this crisis, and whether my approach is still relevant, especially to rely on the competitive advantages. But I'd like to say, if a country develops their economy according to their competitive advantages, they are not only export, they also create jobs for other people. So in a sense, I think that that principle still apply, and it should be good for the world. If China continue to develop its economy according to China's comparative advantages, certainly China will export, but China will also import more from other countries, both high-income country and a resources-abundant country, right? And vice versa. So I think that no matter under what kind of situation, to follow a country's comparative advantages will be a best, option for the country. About the case study about China. For China, I think China needs to do two things. One, China is a transitional economy. So China has a lot of legacy distortion that inherited from the past. China needs to further remove that. But at the same time, China now is a middle-income country. And its wage is rising. So China needs to upgrade to the new industries. And the government needs to play the facilitation role. I have another book called Demystifying the Chinese Economy. And that will have all those analysis.
It's all done.
Yeah. And what will be the world like after the Washington Consensus? Then the world should have a new consensus on the new structural economics. then who, then we'll come back to the who will be, can we identify the cook? Or whether the cook has ability, whether the cook has incentive. The question raised by Kunal and others. Let me answer this question. I think that if you look into the incentives of the government, especially if you look into the incentive of political leadership. I think they have two main incentives. One, to stay in power. The second one, if they can stay in power, they wanted to have a good name in history. And during my 4 years tenure in the World Bank, I had the opportunity to meet with hundreds of political leaders. I never encountered a political leader. His incentive is to destroy their countries. No, I never encountered those kind of political leaders and or elite. But what would be the best way for them to stay in power and to have a good name in the history? Well, to bring the prosperity to their countries. Then they can stay in power and they will have a good name. But the issue, since Adam Smith to now, we do not have a recipe to help them to deliver the prosperity. And as my view show, at the most we have ingredients. And in general, if you follow those kind of as a recipe, in general they failed. And if we have so many smart economists still cannot come up with some kind of good way for them to deliver, how can you expect them to really be able to deliver? And as a result, many policy recommended by us, they followed. They were influenced, just like Ken said, any policy was a slave of all ideas in the past, right? And as a result, they could not deliver. And since they could not deliver, people were disillusioned. And then they wanted to stay in power. They had to introduce all kind of bad intervention. So actually, I never complain about the politician. I think we should complain about ourselves. Why not we cannot come up with some kind of better approach and help them to be successful? And if you have a better approach, I'm sure they are so eager to learn. And I can give you one example. Rwanda, they already achieved 9.8% annual growth rate continuously for 17 years. And certainly, they wanted to maintain those kind of performance. And so when they read my book, they were so excited. And the president of Rwanda, Kigali, he was in China in September during the summer Davos in Tianjin. And he wanted to meet me to further discuss my ideas in the book. But I told him, well, I already have one commitment in Kazakhstan, not in Uzbekistan, and I could not meet him. He stayed in China for 2 days to meet me. And so from what I'm quite encouraged, because not only Rwanda, other countries, they all like to discuss a better way to improve their countries. So I think they have the incentive. And whether they have the ability or not, well, if you look into my recommendation, I think it's much simpler than any recommendation now put on the tables. Business environment improvement. For example, in Burkina Faso last year, they received recommendation for the improvement of their business environment and investment environment. The total item is 520. And how can they implement that? Okay, then the education, then the health. Everything is so hard to implement, and they cannot see the immediate result. For my recommendation, within 1 year, they can immediately see the result. And I can give one example. In Ethiopia, last year, I met with the late Prime Minister Meles, and recommend to him, well, you have comparative advantage in desert sectors. You have inexpensive labor cost, and you also have labor. But so far, the labor sector is very small. Why not go to China to invite foreign direct investment to Ethiopia? So he did that. Within 1 year, they invited one firm to go to relocate their production from China to Ethiopia. Within a few months, that firm became the largest exporter firm in Ethiopia. So the government has ability to do that, right? And especially compared to any other recommendation, my approach is the simplest.
Just last comment now.
Okay. And also, regarding the elite, many people say, well, they may not have the incentive to do that. As I said, any government, even they rely on the elite, the West interest group. But every political leader, they have the room of freedom. They are not hostage They can always do something. They always have the degree of freedom to do something to change the fate of the nation. But we need to give them the right framework. So when they want to do this kind of changes, you can see the result quickly and the benefit the people, build up the political support. And I hope this book will do that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Well, there are no bad policymakers, just bad economists by the sound of it. So you heard it here. I want to thank very much Dirk and Kunal for some fantastic comments and some food for thought, I'm sure. But of course, most of all, I want to thank Justin Lin very much indeed for giving us a fantastic insight into his new book. And we'll do a little plug for you, The Quest for Prosperity. There aren't many books in development economics where you can see quotes from Lewis Carroll, Simon Kuznets, but also Mick Jagger. So I do definitely suggest that you read this book. It is indeed a very easy and very compelling read. Thank you very much indeed, Justin. Thank you, everybody, for coming.